Imagine a man who changed the entire history of philosophy, yet never wrote a single line. Such was Socrates, a living enigma who left no books, speeches, or treatises, only conversations in the squares of Athens. Everything we know about him comes from those who listened to him. His figure does not appear directly in his own writings, but through the memories of others. It's as if everything we know today about Einstein came only from his students' descriptions. That paradox makes Socrates one of the most fascinating figures of the ancient world. Because how does the voice of someone who chose to leave no written trace survive in an era when writing was the key to collective memory? 5th century Athens was boiling with ideas. It was the cultural epicenter of the Mediterranean, with poets, politicians, and thinkers clashing in the agora. And in the middle of it all, a man walked barefoot, dressed in a simple tunic, addressing anyone willing to listen. He posed seemingly innocent questions that ended up dismantling entire beliefs. Socrates did not teach in schools, nor charge for his lessons. He preferred stopping ordinary citizens to break their heads with doubts. This choice to teach in the streets reveals a lot. He wasn't interested in academic titles or social prestige, but in awakening the spark of critical thinking in each person. What kind of genius rejects the power of writing and relies solely on the spoken word? The most intriguing part is that we know his ideas thanks to others. Plato, his most famous disciple, turned him into the protagonist of philosophical dialogues that we still study 2 millennia later. Xenophon, a soldier and writer, also recorded his conversations, though with a more practical and political tone. Even Aristophanes, the comic playwright, ridiculed him in a theatrical play. But here arises the great doubt. How much of what we know is truly Socrates' authentic voice, and how much is interpretation or fiction? It is like watching a movie based on real events but told by different screenwriters. In the end, his essence seems blurred between history, literature, and myth. And that mystery, far from weakening him, turned him into a living legend. His teaching method was radical. He asked questions that seemed simple, like what is justice, or what does it mean to live well? But he insisted so much and pushed the answers to their limits. This technique is known today as the Socratic method. It consists of guiding the interlocutor through contradictions until they realize they don't know as much as they thought. And there arises the opportunity to truly learn. The striking thing is that he didn't offer closed solutions. He left people hanging in the emptiness of their own doubts. Instead of giving answers, he created deeper questions. Thanks to this, Socrates became a machine for planting uncertainty. For him, doubt was the most honest path to knowledge. He rejected the long, ornate speeches that dominated the politics of his time. Instead of speaking for hours, he reduced his phrases to the essential, always insisting that he himself knew nothing. Although those exact words are probably a later summary, they convey his genuine attitude, the humble recognition of his own ignorance. This stance made him even more provocative, because in a city proud of its intellectualism, a man claiming to know nothing was like an uncomfortable mirror. That message struck directly at the egos of politicians, sophists, and citizens who boasted of wisdom. What happens when the most influential man in Athens refuses to proclaim himself a teacher and simply dismantles certainties? Curiously, Socrates did not reject writing out of whim, but conviction. According to accounts, he considered texts to be like paintings, silent, incapable of responding when questioned. For him, authentic thought required living dialogue, where each answer generated new questions. If you think about it, he was right about something. A book does not argue with you, it only offers silence. Orality guaranteed that knowledge remained dynamic, not static. This approach explains why he considered it more valuable to unsettle people with sharp questions in the square than to leave behind a scroll full of dead answers. Incredibly, in his rejection of writing, he anticipated modern debates about interaction and real communication. Not everyone loved him. On the contrary, his style made him a public enemy. Politicians saw him as a nuisance that disrupted their speeches. The sophists, teachers who charged for teaching rhetoric, considered him a threat to their business. Little by little, he gained a reputation as an uncomfortable figure, even dangerous for the city's stability. Athens officially accused him of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. Two explosive charges in a deeply religious society proud of its traditions. Being condemned for questioning the authority of the gods was equivalent to attacking the soul of the polis. And Socrates, true to his style, did not defend himself with pleas, but with unyielding coherence to what he believed true. The trial of Socrates was a spectacle. 3 juries of citizens listened to him, and he, instead of apologizing, used the court as another stage for questioning. His refusal to retract led to a guilty verdict. The sentence was to drink hemlock, a deadly poison. The striking thing is that he accepted the sentence with serenity, arguing that fearing death was absurd, because no one knows what comes after. Plato relates that his final moments were a philosophical lesson in themselves, teaching with his death what he had preached in life. Absolute coherence. That detail turned his execution into an eternal symbol of intellectual integrity. He died, but he did so under his own principles, never willing to renounce truth. The legacy of Socrates is so immense that Western philosophy is largely born from his figure. Plato built his entire work as a dialogue with him, and Aristotle, Plato's disciple, extended those lines until laying the foundations of science and logic. In fact, without Socrates, the philosophical tradition as we know it today might not exist. It is fascinating to think that a chain of thought that shaped entire universities and political models comes from someone who never picked up a pen. His method became the seed of pedagogy, law, and even psychology, because teaching with questions remains a powerful strategy. He showed us that wisdom is not about accumulating data, but about learning to question it without fear. Beyond philosophy, Socrates embodies an attitude toward life, constant pursuit. He never settled for a superficial answer. He always wanted to go further. His ability to question the obvious still resonates in our time. When we demand transparency from a politician, when we distrust a doubtful piece of news, when we ask ourselves why we accept certain rules, we are, unknowingly, acting like him. Doubt has been a driving force for social, scientific, and cultural change, and that seed was sown in the Athenian street, where Socrates ceaselessly asked questions. Perhaps his greatest lesson is not a concrete idea, but the eternal invitation not to swallow any certainty without first chewing it with critical thought. A little-known aspect is his radical austerity. Socrates lived with almost no possessions. He walked barefoot through the city, rejected luxuries, and if he attended banquets, he was known for drinking without getting drunk. His lifestyle contrasted with the wealth and ambitions of many Athenians. This coherence made him even more puzzling. He did not seek riches, did not write for fame, did not want political power. His only interest seemed to be truth. In a sense, he lived like a street philosopher, uncomfortable for the powerful yet magnetic for the youth who listened to him. That ascetic vigor recalls later figures who marked history, such as mystics, saints, or sages, who chose to renounce material things to embrace their vision of the world. Another striking fact is his indirect influence on Athenian democracy. Although he did not take part in formal politics, his constant questioning eroded trust in empty speeches. Some historians believe his critical attitude contributed to the social tensions of the time. However, far from weakening democracy, his example enriched it, because he taught the necessity of thinking citizens. He criticized ignorance and arrogance, two mortal enemies of self-government. Athens considered him dangerous, but deep down he embodied the most authentic voice of a city where debate had to be the heart of public life. The irony is that the very democracy he strengthened with his questions ultimately took his life through a mass trial. Many intellectuals afterwards have seen him as a martyr of free thought. For Enlightenment writers, Socrates was an example of resistance to the tyranny of majority opinion. In the Middle Ages, he was reinterpreted as a symbol of virtue, and in modernity, as a reference for ethical consistency. Each era has appropriated him in its own way, constructing his myth out of the little that we know. That adaptability makes him almost universal. There is no other philosopher so often cited who never wrote a single line. He is like an immortal echo that transforms with each generation. And perhaps that is exactly what he wanted. That ideas not fossilize in a dusty book, but live in the constant ebb and flow of human conversation. The most puzzling thing is that, without leaving behind a single text, Socrates managed to be more influential than many prolific authors. His absence of writing became an immortal presence. Because by not having fixed words, each generation reinvents him, as if he were eternally alive, asking us questions. It is a unique case where absence transforms into an infinite source of inspiration. The voice of Socrates lives on because it was never trapped in dead letters, but beats in the very act of questioning. It is a brutal reminder that sometimes the most powerful stories are not written on paper, but engraved in collective memory. And that memory, even today, continues to hear the questions he once sowed in the streets of Athens.